Hi guy, welcome back TV Spoilers. Nick had once believed the worst moment of his life was the night he faced Matt head-on. And nearly denied the pain in his injured leg forced him to grit his teeth through every step as if his own body had turned traitor. But the truth was that surviving didn't bring relief. It left behind something heavier. Something that clung to him in silence, an obsession that kept dragging him toward the edge of his own rules. Nick no longer trusted the idea of letting the police handle it, not because he rejected the law, but because he had watched Matt bend every system he touched. Matt always found the gap. Matt always turned procedure into a psychological game. Matt always had the patience to wait until his opponent collapsed under the weight of their own fear. Nick was terrified that if Matt remained inside the legal framework, still able to speak, still able to bargain, still able to twist the narrative, then Nick's near death wouldn't be the final price. It would only be the opening chapter of a longer, uglier revenge. That fear, mixed with the humiliation of having been forced into weakness, shaped a new decision inside Nick, a reckless, dangerous move to end Matt for good, now, without witnesses, without approval, and without the risk of Matt turning survival into victory again. Nick saw an opportunity that might never come twice. Matt was being held by Jack. In a town where everyone had networks, leverage, and invisible alliances, the fact that someone like Matt was locked away in Jack's control felt like a rare pause in the storm. A sealed box temporarily out of reach. Nick understood Jack wasn't doing this for pleasure or simple revenge. Jack had reasons, methods, and principles he wanted to believe still defined him. But Nick also understood that those principles were the weakness. Jack could keep Matt quiet for a while, but eventually Jack would be forced to bring everything into the light the right way. And that right way was exactly what Nick couldn't tolerate anymore. Nick didn't want to wait for Matt to enter a process Matt could manipulate, to become the victim in his own story, to turn everyone's attention into debate and doubt while Nick remained the one haunted by what nearly happened. Nick wanted an ending, not a waiting room. He wanted it now, even if the price was crossing a line he had spent years swearing he would never cross. The injured leg meant Nick couldn't rely on speed or brute strength. It forced calculation. He couldn't beat Matt with power, he could only beat him by moving first, by being quiet, by becoming colder than he wanted to admit was possible. Nick approached the place where Matt was being held like a man, stepping into forbidden territory inside himself. Everything in him was stretched tight and yet strangely hollow, partly from pain, partly from rage, and partly from a vague dread that he was turning into the very kind of man he used to condemn. He didn't carry confidence. He carried resolve. He told himself that Matt was not someone you contained with mercy or reason. But the more Nick repeated it, the clearer another voice became in the back of his mind. Nick was the one choosing a road with no return. Getting past Jack's security didn't feel like a dramatic break-in. It felt like slipping through a maze built from habits, principles, and the quiet arrogance of someone who believed control was permanent. Nick watched everything with the brutal clarity of a man who had already failed once. Rhythm gaps, blind angles, sounds that could be swallowed by wind or machinery. He was patient, stubborn, and ruthless enough to treat pain like a fee he owed the night. When he finally reached Matt, Nick didn't feel triumph. He felt a thick, unsettling silence, as if that room had collected every old mistake between them: hatred, humiliation, fear, and the knowledge that one wrong move could turn everything irreversible. Nick moved Matt out in secret. For a brief moment, Nick believed he had regained the upper hand. He believed that once Matt was out of Jack's hands, out of anyone else's rules, Nick would control the ending. But Matt was not an object to be relocated. Matt didn't panic. He didn't beg. He didn't react like prey. He observed. He measured. He waited. And what disgusted Nick most wasn't Matt's resistance, it was the feeling that Matt understood Nick better than Nick wanted to admit. Matt read the urgency in Nick's grip, the raw hatred in his silence, the desperation underneath the risk. And that understanding let Matt fight back without needing many moves. He only needed to destabilize Nick. He only needed to make Nick lose control. The plan began to unravel in the smallest details ordinary people would miss. But Matt never did. A breath that tightened because the leg throbbed. A half-second pause to steady balance. A reflexive glance to check whether they were being watched. Matt gathered those fragments like shards of glass and built a blade. While Nick struggled to maintain control, Matt pulled him into the familiar battlefield of psychology, forcing Nick to juggle, holding Matt, hiding everything from exposure. and convincing himself he was still the man doing what had to be done. And the harder Nick tried to justify it, the more he heard the terrifying truth beneath it. Nick was behaving as if the law no longer applied to him, as if moral boundaries were for other people, as if the target could excuse the method. Then the opening came. Not because Nick was foolish, but because Nick was too exhausted and too hurt to be perfect. Matt broke free with a cold, efficient cruelty. It didn't look like frantic escape. It looked like a table flip he'd been waiting to execute at the right second. Nick was yanked into the position of the hunted. And what truly terrified him was the realization that Matt didn't only want to run. Matt wanted Nick to pay twice, wanted to turn Nick into proof that anyone who dared touch Matt would be crushed, physically and publicly. Matt struck back. The confrontation became a storm of violence and suppressed hatred. Nick was already injured, so every struggle felt like tearing deeper into his body. He fought to stay upright, to stay focused, but Matt knew exactly where to hit. Not just the leg, the confidence, the fear of being exposed, the dread that Nick had just turned himself into the criminal. In one brutal moment, Nick saw his future, himself on the ground, blood and pain mixing, and Matt standing over his collapse like a man, proving again that survival always belonged to him. They wrestled hard, and Matt inflicted another serious injury on Nick. But the most dangerous damage wasn't on the skin, it was inside Nick's mind. He understood that if this exploded into the open, he wouldn't only be a victim of assault. He would be the man who trespassed, who secretly removed Matt, who turned a hidden holding into something that could be framed as kidnapping beyond the law. Nick could already see an indictment hovering above him, could already imagine the judging eyes. The question everyone would ask, what were you thinking? And the only answer Nick feared was the simplest one: he believed he had the right. He believed that because Matt was monstrous, he could become something close to monstrous to destroy him. The confrontation ended with Nick badly hurt, and the threat of legal fallout no longer felt like a distant possibility. Matt vanished from Nick's control, leaving chaos behind like smoke in the lungs. Nick's failure tasted worse than the first near-death because this time he hadn't only lost to Matt, he had lost to himself. He had cracked the part of his identity that had always told him he was different from Matt. And then the worst truth arrived. Dropping like a blade after all the scandal and blood, Nick discovered that Matt was Victor's long-lost son. It didn't make Matt less dangerous. It made everything more poisonous. Nick felt his throat tighten with rage and fear at once. If Matt was Victor's missing son, then everything Nick had just attempted every risk, every secret step was no longer simply about eliminating an enemy. It became a sin that could detonate the entire family. Nick didn't need to imagine Victor's reaction to discovering a lost child amid a storm of chaos. And he didn't need to imagine what Victor would do if he learned Nick had tried to handle that child outside the law. In that instant, Nick understood he was trapped between two disasters. If Matt remained free, Matt could destroy Hyman, perhaps destroy the family, but if Nick tried to end Matt, Nick might become the man who shattered his own house, the man who put a weapon into Victor's hands. Worst of all, Nick could no longer pretend he was innocent. He had chosen to cross the line. Now the blood connection turned that line into an abyss. Lying there, caught between pain and panic, Nick couldn't even decide which fear was greater, Matt or Victor. And that confusion was exactly what Matt was best at, planting, making an opponent lose their footing, making them destroy themselves with frantic decisions. When Nick stared into the empty space where Matt had disappeared, he didn't only see the danger of prosecution. He saw a family war waiting to ignite the moment the truth surfaced. Matt, clever, predatory, built for survival, would not waste the chance to use bloodline as armor. And Nick, bound to Victor by love, resentment, loyalty, and fear, knew one wrong move could cost him not only his freedom, but his place in the only family he had never fully dared to defy. Nick forced himself to breathe, forced himself to try to rise. But the world shook as if it might fracture. The next battle wouldn't be about who was stronger. It would be about who controlled the story. Matt would want to tell it in the way that protected Matt. Nick would want to bury it before it became public tragedy. But Victor was the one man who could turn blood into absolute power. And the one man who could turn Nick's mistake into a sentence without ever needing a courtroom. That thought turned Nick cold, because it dragged him toward the one question he couldn't escape. What would he do when he had to look Victor in the eye and admit he tried to erase his enemy, only to learn that enemy was Victor's son? And just before the night blurred at the edges from pain and exhaustion, Nick understood the true strike Matt had landed didn't come from the newest injury. It came from the trap Matt left behind. Nick would have to choose stay silent and let Matt become Victor's most toxic secret, or speak and accept that he might be seen as the traitor who tried to destroy Victor's blood. And somewhere out there, Matt was free, carrying the most dangerous weapon of all, a name. a lineage, and the certainty that Victor Newman would eventually come looking. In Genoa City right now, everything feels like a house that's been smoldering for years, just waiting for the right gust of wind to ignite it again. Power struggles aren't really about right and wrong anymore, they are about who controls the truth and who gets crushed by it. In that atmosphere, Matt is no longer a passing threat. He's become a stubborn shadow that clings to the Newman family's daily life, forcing them into constant vigilance, turning every promise of peace into nothing more than fragile self-soothing. The early days of 2026 are already coded in the chain reactions from Matt's return and his hunger for retaliation, enough to make every conversation inside the Newman home feel like an unofficial interrogation, enough to make every glance carry suspicion. At the center of it all, Nikki is being driven into the one state she hates most, desperate, but still expected to look composed, crumbling on the inside, but still required to stand tall on the outside. Everything she believed she had survived, everything she thought had been buried in the past, now hangs above her like a tightening noose. Nikki isn't just facing Matt as a new disruptor, she's facing a blind spot in the family history itself, a truth that was protected, distorted, or deliberately forgotten. And the most terrifying thing about this kind of truth is that it doesn't need to shout to destroy you. It simply has to appear at the right moment, in the right place, when you're already vulnerable. And the foundation of your moral certainty and trust collapses as easily as wet plaster. Nikki has lived through enough loss to understand that some pain doesn't kill you quickly. It keeps you alive, so you have to live inside it. So when the truth begins to surface piece by piece, fitting together in a way that becomes impossible to deny, doesn't panic only because of the present. She panics because she realizes the past she has been telling herself may be missing a chapter. And if that chapter is missing, then every choice, every forgiveness, every time she tried to hold the family together like a supporting beam, may have been built on a false assumption. Nikki isn't afraid of the truth because it's ugly. She's afraid because it could turn every sacrifice she made into something cruelly meaningless. Victor is shaken too, but in a different way. He isn't a man easily knocked down by emotion. He tends to turn emotion into a weapon, rage into strategy, fear into power. But there is one kind of blow even Victor can't calculate his way around. The blow that strikes straight into his instincts as a father, into his pride of bloodline, into the belief that he always knows what belongs to him and what has been taken from him. The possibility that Matt is his long-lost son isn't just biological information. It's a reversal of position. It turns an enemy into blood. It transforms a hunt into a moral question. It turns every ruthless move Victor might have been willing to make into something that could recoil violent libicus from that moment forward. Anyone who touches Matt is touching Victor Newman's blood. Victor's shock doesn't show up as weakness. It manifests as silence that runs too deep. In his eyes, what moves isn't tears or softness, it's a calculation that has been disrupted. Victor is used to viewing life as a chessboard. But now a strange new piece has appeared with his own fingerprints on it. He can't immediately dismiss Matt as nothing but a threat anymore. But he also can't immediately accept Matt as family. That contradiction feels like an insult to a man like Victor, an insult because he can't control it. An insult because he's being forced to feel it. An insult because someone in the shadows once had enough nerve, enough power, or enough cruelty to hide a child from him. Nikki can see that shift, and it makes her desperation even heavier. Because Nikki knows Victor better than anyone. He may forgive many things, but he rarely forgives being robbed of truth. He can lose a hand if it's a hand he chose to play. But he cannot tolerate being played behind his back, especially when it involves his children. Nikki understands that if Victor believes Matt is his son, Victor will enter dangerous territory. Either he will try to pull Matt close in order to control him, or he will seek to crush every trace of the person who engineered this betrayal. Either way, Genoa City will tremble, and the Newman family will no longer be able to walk gently past the truth. And then there is Nick's second fuse that could set everything on fire. Nikki knows her son has been pushed to the edge since Matt resurfaced and turned their lives into a predator's hunt. Nick handling it himself is no longer just a reckless impulse. It's the symptom of a man who has had his sense of safety stolen. When a man who once tried to live by principles starts believing principles don't work against someone like Matt, that is when the family faces the real danger, not only from Matt, but from the way they respond to Matt. Nikki's fear deepens because she knows that taking matters into your own hands rarely ends cleanly. It leaves consequences that can't be undone. Nikki's desperation isn't only about the revelation that Matt could be the lost son. It's about the domino effect that instantly forms in her mind. Victor will react, Nick will react, and Matt, most calculating of them all, will exploit every reaction to elevate himself into a position no one dares challenge. Matt was already dangerous as an outsider. He becomes even more dangerous if he carries the label Victor Newman's son. Because that label has the weight to make people hesitate, to make accusations feel politically sensitive, to turn punishment into family conflict instead of justice. Nikki sees the trap clearly, and she understands Matt may have targeted the Newmans' deepest weakness. They can fight the world, but they struggle to fight blood. That's when the question begins to spread. No one says it out loud at first, but it fills the air like smoke. Who is that woman? Nikki feels the question like a blade, because that woman isn't merely an unnamed figure. She is the only key that can unlock the entire hidden room of the past. Somewhere, a woman stood at the intersection of fate, where a child vanished, where a truth was buried, where a powerful family was manipulated without realizing it. And if she exists, then a decision was Matt's own deliberate decision to separate Matt from Victor. One deliberate decision to keep the secret alive for years. One deliberate decision to let it resurface at the moment it could do maximum damage. Nikki is torn apart by the terrible logic of it. No secret survives that long without someone protecting it. No disappearance remains that clean without someone actively erasing footprints. Nikki doesn't want to think that way, because the more she does, the more she feels trapped in a reflection of a different life, where the Newmans weren't the unstoppable force they pride themselves on being, but simply another family that could be deceived, manipulated, guided by unseen hands. And if that's true, Nikki faces the most painful question of all. Where was she when it happened? What did she believe? What signals did she ignore? What silence did she accidentally help preserve? Victor, meanwhile, is provoked by the same question in a darker way. In his eyes, that woman isn't a romantic mystery. She is the person who challenged his absolute authority. The right to know, the right to possess truth, the right to decide his child's fate. For Victor, this cannot end with emotional acceptance. It must have an origin. It must have a culprit. It must have a new order rebuilt. Because if Victor accepts that a lost son could exist without his knowledge, then he accepts that his power has a hole. And Victor Newman does not sleep peacefully when he knows he has a weakness. But the tragedy is that the harder they chase that woman, the more they risk being led by Matt. Because Matt doesn't need to appear constantly to instill fear. His existence alone, combined with the question of her identities, enough to make the family tear itself apart with suspicion and reflex. Nikki can feel the spiral tightening. The truth changes Victor. Victor's change provokes Nick. Nick's actions create the possibility of mistakes, and mistakes create opportunity for Matt. And Matt is the kind of man who waits for opportunity the way others wait for sunrise. Nikki clings to one desperate purpose to keep from collapsing completely. She has to stop her family from destroying itself before Matt strikes again. But that goal feels nearly impossible now, when everyone is operating on instinct. Nikki can sense Victor standing at a crossroads. On one side, the forced recognition that blood means something; on the other, the accumulated hatred for what Matt has done. Nikki can sense Nick at another crossroads. On one side, fear that Matt will keep coming. On the other, fear that if Matt truly is Victor's son, then anything Nick does to Matt could become an unforgivable sin. Those crossroads don't offer a clean path. They only offer the path that does less damaging in the Newman world. Less damage can still be a devastating kind of destruction. Nikki's desperation is no longer vague emotion. It has shape and weight. It lives in the way she looks at Victor and realizes there are battles she cannot stop with love. It lives in the way she thinks of Nick and realizes there are wounds inside her son that a mother cannot bandage with advice. It lives in the way she thinks of Matt. Woe should be nothing but an enemy, and realizes he might now be part of the family in the cruelest possible way. And it lives in that question: woe is that woman, because Nikki understands that, whether she wants it or not, the past is going to be dug up layer by layer until Genoa City sees what the Newmans tried to keep sealed. Nikki begins to grasp something even worse. This truth won't only change how Victor looks at Matt. It will change how Victor looks at everyone around him, including Nikki herself. Because Victor will start asking who knew and stayed silent, who suspected and never spoke, who hid things and never admitted it. In a family where power always travels with control, that question is a timed bomb. Nikki isn't afraid of Victor's anger. Nikki is afraid of Victor losing trust, because when Victor loses trust, he doesn't retreat. He strikes. And he strikes in ways that make returning to normal impossible. Victor, for his part, is pulled by a dark instinct. If Matt is his son, then Matt must belong to him no matter what it takes. But that thought opens another dangerous door. What if Matt doesn't want to belong to anyone? What if Matt uses this truth as a shield to keep destroying, and uses Victor as protection so no one dares hit back? Nikki sees the nightmare forming. Victor tries to grip Matt to control him. But the tighter he grips, the deeper he sinks into mud. The more he protects, the more Matt uses him as a tool. The more Victor's rage grows. the easier it becomes for him to make the kind of mistake Matt has been waiting for. And everything circles back to the original blind spot. Who is that woman? Nikki realizes this isn't only the key to the past, it's the key to the future. Because if they find her, they'll learn why Matt was separated from Victor, why the truth was buried, and why it resurfaced now. But if they find her, they may also trigger an entirely new chain of consequence zones Nikki isn't sure she can survive. Still, she understands they have no choice. The secret has already leaked. It will not fit back into the box. And with every passing hour, Matt gains more time to shape the truth into advantage. Nikki tries to steady herself with one last thought. At least she still might prevent Victor and Nick from turning themselves into accomplices in Matt's game. But the thought barely forms before it is crushed by a cold sensation, crawling up her Spinian instinct that someone has already moved ahead of them. Nikki realizes her desperation isn't rooted in not knowing the truth. It's rooted in the fear that Matt wants them to know, wants them to panic, wants them to chase that woman like lost souls while they dig through the past. Matt can strike in the present, and then the hook lands like a silent cut. Nikki sees Victor's face change in the way only those who have lived beside him long enough can recognize. The sign that he has just obtained a new piece of information, something that makes him furious, cold, wounded, and decisive all at once. Nikki doesn't yet know what he learned, only what it means. The hunt for that woman has begun, and when Victor begins to hunt, someone always gets crushed. But Nikki's final realization is even sharper. The question, who is that woman, is no longer trapped in the past. It's standing dangerously close to the present. Dangerously close to the Newman family, close enough that Nikki can no longer rule out the most terrifying possibility of all, that the woman never disappeared at all. She has simply been waiting for the perfect moment to step forward, carrying an answer that could save Victor from Matt, push the entire Newman dynasty off a cliff with no way back. On our TV Spoilers channel, I'm always looking for content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.